She was standing at the edge of the ballroom, and every single eye in that room was on her, but not with admiration. Her name was Elara. She was 22 years old. She had dark hair pinned up in a careful knot, and she was wearing a deep blue velvet gown with lace along the collar that her late father had once called the color of a steady heart. She sat at the long table in the center of the grand hall, her hands folded over the worn leather cover of a ledger, her face still and composed, even as the world around her crumbled. The room smelled of candle wax and perfume, and something else, something cold, judgment. Around her sat the who's who of their city, women in pink satin and pearl earrings, men with gold watch chains and lifted chins. They had all come, supposedly, to witness the reading of the estate papers, but every one of them knew what was truly happening today. They had come to watch a girl lose everything. To Elara's right sat her stepmother, Lady Eleanora, and if you had looked at Eleanora that morning and been asked to describe her, you might have said elegant, you might have said composed, you might even have said kind, because Eleanora had the rare gift of wearing cruelty like a garment cut perfectly to her measurements fitted, flattering and utterly invisible to those who did not know what to look for. But Elara knew. She had known since she was 9 years old. Eleanora did not look at her stepdaughter. She was sipping from a small china cup, her little finger raised slightly, her eyes moving around the room in the practiced way of a woman who has spent her whole life calculating which person in every room was the most useful to her. Beside Eleanora sat Genevieve, her daughter, and Elara's stepsister. Genevieve was dressed in rose gold silk, with diamond drops at her ears, and she was smiling the way that cats smile, just before they swipe at something. She had her mother's eyes, pale, sharp, and always just slightly ahead of the moment. A man stood behind Elara, older, nervous, shuffling papers. He was the family solicitor, Mr. Hemford, and he had aged 10 years in the last 2 weeks. He cleared his throat 3 times before anyone acknowledged him. Mr. Hemford, the estate, as per Lord Ashford's final will and testament, passes in its entirety to his widow, Lady Eleanora Ashford, to be administered at her discretion. Miss Elara Ashford is to receive £100, personal effects, and the cottage at the edge of the northern property. £100, a cottage, the edge of the northern property which everyone in the room knew was mostly bogland. Someone behind Elara almost laughed. She heard a soft, quickly swallowed sound, and she kept her face exactly as it was. She had cried enough. She had cried for 3 days, alone in her room, after her father died. She was done crying now, at least in public. But what came next was the part she had not seen coming. Lady Eleanora set down her cup with a soft, deliberate click. Lady Eleanora, there is one additional matter. Given that Elara's financial circumstances are now reduced, I have taken it upon myself, out of maternal generosity, to see her settled. A match has been arranged. The room went very quiet. Elara, I am sorry what? Lady Eleanora, marriage, my dear. It is the only sensible path for a young woman in your situation. I would not leave you to suffer uncertainty. She said the word suffer, the way people say it when they are the cause of the suffering, and are very much enjoying themselves. The man who had been arranged for Elara walked in through the side door then, and the room, which had already been very quiet, went completely silent. He was young, perhaps 30, but he moved like a man who had been broken and put back together at odd angles. His clothes were clean. Someone had clearly done their best, but they were simple and rough. His hands were calloused, his jaw unshaved, his dark hair slightly too long, and there was a scar along his left cheekbone that he had made no effort to hide. He stood in the doorway and looked around the room with eyes that were, and this was the part that confused Elara, even though her shock was not embarrassing. His eyes were not embarrassed at all. They were watchful, those eyes, steady, the color of deep water just before a storm. He does not look away. Every other man in this room is looking at me with pity or contempt. He is simply looking, like he is reading something he has not decided the meaning of yet. Elara turned back to her stepmother. Elara, you cannot be serious. Lady Eleanora, I am always serious, Elara. You know this about me. And that ordinary, almost bored reply was what broke something open in Elara's chest. Not rage, not grief, something older than both. Something that felt, if she was honest, a great deal like the beginning of understanding. Her stepmother had planned all of this. Every step. The will, the witnesses, the arranged match with a man who looked like he had walked out of the roughest corner of the city. The public setting. The china cup. The little finger. She had not been outmaneuvered today. She had been outmaneuvered years ago, and today was only the ceremony. Elara looked at the man in the doorway one more time. He was still watching her, and for just a moment, one brief, strange moment, she thought she saw something move in those dark eyes. No pity, not cruelty, something almost like an apology. She straightened her spine. She pressed her palms flat on the table, and she made a decision. I will not give them the satisfaction of falling apart today. Not here, not now, not in front of her. She rose from her chair, smoothed her blue gown, and looked at the room, at the women, with their fans and their whispers, at Genevieve's smug little smile, at her stepmother's perfectly composed face, and she said nothing. Nothing was, at that moment, the loudest thing she could say. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you are watching from. I would love to say hello to you and know how far our story has reached. To understand how Elara ended up at that table on that morning, you need to go back 9 years. She was 13 when her father, Lord Edmund Ashford, remarried. Edmund was a genuinely good man, which is rarer than most people admit, and he had been lonely since Elara's mother died. He had also been, and this was the thing that cost him everything, too trusting. Lady Eleanora had arrived in their city 2 years before the marriage. Nobody knew precisely where she was from. She said a northern county. She had papers, a modest widow's pension, and a daughter, Genevieve, then 11, already wearing her mother's expressions like a second skin. What Eleanora had that made men like Edmund helpless was not beauty, exactly. She was handsome, well-groomed, and perfectly mannered. But the real thing she had was the ability to make a person feel seen. When Eleanora looked at Edmund and asked about his work, his memories, his late wife, she asked in a way that made him feel as though his answer was the most important thing she had ever been given. That is a rare talent. It is also a devastating weapon. They married within the year. Elara had tried to tell her father, once she was 14 by then, and she had already noticed certain things. The way Eleanora's warmth switched off like a lamp the moment Edmund left a room. The way Genevieve was never corrected, never denied, never asked to share. The way the household accounts began to be routed through Eleanora's own solicitor, Elara. Papa, I think you should look more carefully at the way she... Lord Edmund, Elara, she is your stepmother. I need you to be fair to her. Edmund had looked at his daughter with a kind of gentle exhaustion that broke her heart even then, because she understood it. He was tired. He was happy again, for the first time in years. He did not want to doubt the thing that was making him happy. She had not tried again. The years that followed were a careful education in a very particular kind of cruelty, the kind that leaves no marks, the kind that would be difficult to explain to someone who had not experienced it. Eleanora never struck her, never shouted. She simply made Elara smaller, year by year, comment by comment. A dress that arrived for Genevieve but not for Elara, with a sympathetic tilt of the head. Genevieve has social engagements, darling. You are so content at home, aren't you? An invitation to a winter gathering that Elara simply forgot to pass on. A tutor dismissed the one who had been teaching Elara mathematics and languages because he was not needed for a girl of Elara's prospects. Elara had quietly continued teaching herself. She read everything in the library. She kept her own accounts. She learned, because learning was the one thing no one could take from you once it was inside you. When Edmund died of a sudden illness, the doctor said Elara was 22. She had not wept in front of Eleanora. She had gone to her father's bedside, held his hand through the last night, and let him go quietly. Eleanora had wept magnificently at the funeral. It had been a remarkable performance. The announcement came 3 weeks after the estate reading. A notice in the city's official gazette, discreet but unmistakable to those who read between the lines. The Duke of Aldenmere, recently returned from affairs abroad, intends to take up residence in the city and will be selecting a household and considering prospects for a suitable match in the coming season. Inquiries may be directed through the office of the city register. Eleanora read the notice twice. Then she set the paper down, called for her morning coffee, and sat for a long moment in the kind of perfect stillness that was, in her, a sign of intense internal motion. A duke, unmarried, in their city. Genevieve was 19. Her debut had been acceptable, but not spectacular. Eleanora had spent the last 2 seasons cultivating the right connections, attending the right events, being seen in the right places, all in the calculated hope that a match of significance would eventually present itself. And now here it was. Not just a match of significance. A duke. She was already planning before the coffee arrived. There was only one problem, and she identified it immediately, with the clean efficiency of a woman who has trained herself to see obstacles before they become crises. Elara. Elara was 22, still unmarried, still living in the household. She was not as fashionable as Genevieve, not as practiced in the social arts, but she had something that Eleanora had always privately resented, a quality of stillness and sincerity that certain kinds of men found deeply attractive. She could not risk it. Elara needed to be removed from the equation, permanently, publicly, and in a way that left no loose threads. The match with the beggar. Yes, make it a charity story. Make her a laughingstock. Make her so thoroughly beneath the notice of any gentleman of standing that not even kindness could redeem her social position. And do it quickly, before the Duke begins making inquiries. Eleanora picked up her pen and began to write. The man Eleanora found was known in the city's east quarter as Jasper. No family name, just Jasper. He lived near the old canal bridge, in a narrow space between 2 warehouses that most people would not have called a home at all. He was perhaps 30, perhaps older. It was difficult to say, because life in his circumstances had a way of adding years to a face that a comfortable life did not. He had a scar on his left cheekbone. His hair was dark, unwashed. His left leg dragged slightly when he walked, and he used a wooden staff to balance. He was known, in the way that poor people are sometimes known, as good. Not harmless. There is a difference. He did not steal. He helped the children of the quarter carry loads that were too heavy for them. He shared food when he had it. He was, by every account that reached Eleanora's ears, a man of no wealth, and no connections, and no prospects, and exactly no threat to anyone who was comfortable. He was perfect. Eleanora did not approach him herself, of course. She sent her man, Fletcher, a quiet, efficient person who had been with the household for 12 years and knew better than to have opinions with a proposal. A woman would be arranged as a wife. She came with £100 and a cottage. In exchange, he would agree to a public ceremony, witnessed by the community. He would accept the arrangement without question. Fletcher returned with the answer. Fletcher, he said he needs to meet her first, ma'am, before he agrees to anything. Eleanora set down her pen. Lady Eleanora. He said what? Fletcher. He wants to meet the woman first. He was quite clear about it, ma'am. Polite, but clear. She stared at Fletcher for a long moment. Then she laughed a soft, genuine sound, which was the most dangerous kind of laugh she had. Lady Eleanora, a beggar with principles. How delightful. Arrange the meeting. They met in the solicitor's outer office in a neutral space, uncarpeted, with the smell of old paper and dust. Elara sat in one chair, Jasper sat in the other. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elara looked at him directly. She had always done this. Looked at people directly, which Eleanora had spent years trying to train out of her as unladylike. His hands, she noticed, were calloused, but the calluses were in unusual places, not the palms, the way a laborer's would be, but along the edge of the thumb and the first two fingers. Writing, or precision work of some kind. His eyes moved around the room once, twice cataloguing, she thought, before they settled on her. He is not afraid. That is the first thing. Whatever else he is not afraid. Jasper, you do not want this. It was not a question. His voice was quiet and low, the voice of someone who did not speak unless he had something to say. Elara. No, I do not. Jasper. Then why? Elara. Because I have no choice. That is better than this one. That is different from wanting. He was quiet for a moment. Jasper, I will not be unkind to you. I want you to know that before you decide anything. She almost said something sharp about how that was a very low bar to set. But she looked at him again, and the words went quiet inside her, because there was something in the way he had said it. Not apologetic, not trying to be charming, just stating a fact. And I will not be unkind to you. So we agreed on the minimum, at least. The ghost of something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than a smile. Jasper. The minimum. Yes. He stood to leave. At the door, he paused, his back to her. Jasper. My name is Jasper. When you use it, people will treat you differently than if you call me my husband. Use the name. It will be easier. She did not understand what he meant until later. Much later. The ceremony was held in the estate's main hall, in front of exactly as many witnesses as Eleanora could arrange. 40 people. 40 people who were the beating heart of the city's social world, the people whose opinions would spread to 200 people by the next morning, and to the whole city within a week. Elara wore her best dress. It was the blue velvet gown, the one her father had loved. She had made that choice deliberately. If this was to be a humiliation, she would face it wearing something she actually loved, not something that felt like a punishment. Jasper wore clothes that someone she suspected Fletcher had laundered and pressed. They were still simple. He still used his staff. He still moved with that slight drag in his left leg. But he stood straight, and he looked at her during the ceremony with those still, watchful eyes, and he said the words required of him, with a clarity and steadiness that made two of the watching women exchange confused glances. He did not look like a man who was being given something. He looked like a man who was doing something he had chosen to do. Eleanora watched from the edge of the room with Genevieve at her side, and a small, satisfied smile on her face. Job done, loose thread removed. The stage was now clear for Genevieve and the Duke. She did not notice, because she was not looking, that the man she had hired for her scheme had, during the ceremony, very quietly studied every single person in that room, every face, every name that was murmured, every connection. She did not notice, because she had never thought to ask where Jasper had been before he came to live near the canal bridge. That oversight would cost her everything. The cottage was at the north edge of the estate, and it was exactly as miserable as its position on the bog suggested it might be. The roof held, but only just. The fireplace drew badly. The windows were single-paned and leaked cold in long, sighing draughts. Elara stood in the middle of the main room on their first evening there, her small trunk of belongings at her feet, and looked around with the measured calm of someone running a very precise internal inventory. What is here? What is not here? What can be done with what is here? Jasper stood in the doorway, watching her. Elara. The fireplace. Do you know how to fix a drawer? Jasper. Yes. Elara. Good. Start there. I will see what is in the kitchen. He did not move immediately. She turned around and found him looking at her with an expression she could not name. Jasper. You are not going to cry. Elara. Not tonight. Perhaps tomorrow. Jasper. Fair enough. He went to work on the fireplace. She went to the kitchen. There was flour, some salt, 3 aging potatoes, and a string of dried herbs. She made something that was technically bread, and arguably soup, and she set it on the small table between them, without ceremony. They ate in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who are each privately aware that the other is more complicated than expected, and are not yet sure what to do with that awareness. Over the first 2 weeks, Elara noticed things about Jasper. He rose before dawn. She discovered that by accident, she was a light sleeper, and she heard the door, and when she looked out her window, she could see his silhouette against the grey pre-light, moving toward the canal. He always returned before the household would normally be considered awake, and he always looked settled, was the only word she had for it. Not tired, the way a man who had been walking would be. Settled, like someone who had completed a task. He read. She had given him access to the 3 books she had brought with her, a small courtesy, offered without expectation, and he had worked through all 3 within the first week. She had tested him gently, asking a question about something in the 3rd book, and his answer was not the answer of a man who had skimmed. He had read it. He had thought about it. He was also, she was beginning to believe, not as injured as he appeared to be. She had seen it on the 4th day. A wagon horse had spooked near the cottage gate, and a child from the neighboring farm had been directly in its path. Jasper had crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and caught the horse's bridle with both hands, with a grip that stopped a panicked animal in full motion. And for one moment, just one, there had been nothing dragging about his movement at all. When he had turned around and seen her watching, his expression had shifted. He saw me see it. He knows I noticed, and he is not going to explain. She had decided, at that moment, to make no comment. If he had a reason for whatever he was doing, she would wait for it to become apparent. She was not, she reminded herself, in a position to demand explanations from anyone. But she was watching. He came home that evening with a small bunch of early wildflowers, muddy at the stems, and set them on the table without saying anything. She put them in the only jar she had. Neither of them mentioned it. But that night, lying in the small bedroom with the fireplace drawing properly now, and the cold held almost fully at bay, Elara stared at the ceiling and admitted something to herself. I am not as miserable as I expected to be. And that is a confusing and somewhat alarming thing to have to admit. His name was Alistair Rowan, Duke of Aldenmere. And the man who would eventually read this name in gold lettering above the door of the city's most prestigious address had, for the past 8 months, been living as a drifter called Jasper near a canal bridge. This was not, it should be said, an unusual approach for him. Alistair had been doing variations of this kind of work for 7 years, since he was 23, and had inherited not just a title and estates, but a mess of financial corruption that ran so deep through the city's governing systems that the only way to untangle it was to map it from the inside. You could not do that mapping from the top. People lie to power, but they talk freely around someone they have dismissed as irrelevant. The Beggar identity had been constructed carefully. The scar was real. He had earned it in a different city 3 years ago. The limp was not. It was a practiced affectation, maintained with the tedious discipline that undercover work required. The staff was hollow. There were things inside it that would have been very interesting to the city's corrupt guard captain, if he had ever thought to look. Alistair's team of 3 people, operating at careful distances, knew his location. They communicated through a system of marks left on specific walls in the market quarter, which, to anyone else, looked like ordinary scuffs and chalk lines. He had been 9 months into the operation when Lady Eleanora had found him. He had agreed to the marriage not because he had no choice. He could have simply disappeared, as he had done before in other cities. He had agreed because, at the moment Fletcher had approached him, his operation had reached a critical phase. He needed access to a property on the north edge of the estate, which had, under its unremarkable bog surface, a hidden room that had been used to store falsified financial records connecting three of the city's most powerful men to a decade of embezzlement. The North Cottage. The marriage had been, from a purely operational standpoint, a convenient solution to a logistics problem. He had not, however, expected Elara. He had expected he was not proud to admit this to someone like Genevieve. He had seen enough of the wealthy households of this city to have developed, he now recognized, certain unfair assumptions. A daughter of the house, raised in that environment, probably shaped by it, probably vain, probably fragile, in the way people are fragile when they have never been asked to be strong. Instead, Elara, who had looked at him in the solicitor's office without flinching, and said, "I will not be unkind to you," as though it was a matter of basic logic. Who had, on the first night in the cottage, assessed the resources available to her in a space that would have defeated most people he had encountered and made something resembling dinner. Who had seen him stop the horse and said nothing, just watched and filed it away behind those careful, intelligent eyes. She is not what I thought, and that is inconvenient, because the operation does not have space for complications, and she is the kind of person who becomes a complication not by trying to, but by simply being who she is. He was, he told himself, being disciplined, professional. He went out before dawn because there was work to do, messages to receive, information to gather, the slow, precise work of assembling evidence that would hold up in a formal inquiry. He came back. He fixed the fireplace. He read her books and returned them without comment. He left her wildflowers because she had looked, for one unguarded moment that she would not have wanted him to see, at the empty jar on the windowsill, with an expression of such quiet loss that he had felt it somewhere he had thought was long past feeling things. He was being professional, entirely professional. He also noticed, with the precise attention that 7 years of undercover work develops in a person, that she was teaching herself things. He found a page of calculations on the table one morning, complex ones, the kind that required a good understanding of mathematics, and the handwriting was hers. She was doing accounts. He did not ask whose. Later he would discover that she had been quietly, carefully, working on her father's original estate books, the ones before Eleanora took over administration, looking for something. Following the money the way he was following the money, with different tools and the same determination. She had gotten further than he expected. Lady Eleanora's campaign to secure the Duke for Genevieve was, by any measure, a masterpiece of social engineering. She had rented the second largest ballroom in the city for a luncheon, invited 40 of the most connected families, and ensured that Genevieve, in a pale gold gown that had cost a sum Eleanora preferred not to think about too directly, was placed at the precise center of every tableau. The Duke, however, proved elusive. His office communicated through formal, impeccably polite letters that said very little. He was in the city, yes. He would be making his presence known in due course. He thanked Lady Eleanora for her kind invitations. He did not come to the luncheon. Genevieve, Mother, no one has even seen him. How can he be selecting a match if he hasn't attended anything? Lady Eleanora, he is being cautious. Clever men are often cautious. Don't fidget. Genevieve, he might not even be in the city. It could all be a rumor. Lady Eleanora, he is in the city. I have it on very good authority. She did not say what authority. The truth was, she had received a tip from a man she had paid not inexpensively to locate the Duke and report his movements. The man had, after 2 weeks of searching, come back with the information that the Duke had indeed arrived, was indeed residing in the city, and had been seen entering and exiting the official records office on 4 separate occasions. The records office, not the ballrooms, not the estates of the wealthy. The records office. A man who goes to the records office instead of the social season is a man doing something specific. What is he looking for? She filed this information and moved on to the next problem: money. The campaign for Genevieve was running significantly over budget. The luncheon, the gown, the bribes to 3 separate court officials to ensure Genevieve's name was mentioned favorably in formal circles, it was adding up to a sum that made even Eleanora, who was not a timid woman about money, slightly anxious. She was beginning to feel, for the first time in years, a sensation she had worked very hard to eliminate from her emotional repertoire: pressure. At the North Cottage, life had settled into a rhythm that Elara would not have predicted and was not sure what to call. Jasper had, over the past weeks, begun to be present more. He still went out before dawn. She had stopped wondering about this in any anxious way. It was simply a thing he did, but he was home for the mornings now. He had fixed the kitchen's broken shelf without being asked. He had sourced, from somewhere she did not question, a second good lamp. He had also, and this was the thing that occupied a quiet corner of her mind more than she admitted, begun to talk. Not much. Not about himself. Never about himself. But questions. About the city. About the families she had grown up watching. About the way money moved in their social world. About who owed what to whom, and how those debts shaped behavior. She had answered, mostly, because she was good at observation, and had 19 years of it to draw from, and talking through what she had observed helped her organize it. She did not yet recognize that the conversations were also, from his side, a form of professional inquiry. But one evening autumn now, the light was going early, both of them at the table, with the lamp between them. She had paused mid-sentence and looked at him. "Elara, you ask a great many questions for a man who arrived here with nothing to say." He looked back at her, and for a moment, just one, she had the very clear impression of a man deciding exactly how much of the truth to give. "Jasper, I find the city interesting. Elara, you find the city's power structures interesting." Jasper, "Yes." Elara, "Why?" The pause this time was longer. Jasper, "Because power structures built on corruption are unstable, and when they collapse, the people at the bottom get hurt the worst. They always do." She was quiet for a moment. "Elara, that sounds like something a person says when they have seen it happen." Jasper, "It does." He did not elaborate. But that night, she lay awake a long time, turning the sentence over in her mind. "He is not who he is supposed to be. I am more certain of this every day. The question is not whether I am right. The question is what I do with being right." She decided, for now, to do nothing, to wait, to watch, and to trust. And this surprised her, because trust had not been a thing she had offered easily in recent years. The fact that however much he was concealing, he had never once been unkind to her. The minimum, he had said. They had exceeded the minimum some time ago, without either of them saying so out loud. The trouble came from the direction of the canal, as trouble in that part of the city often did. There was a group that operated out of the East Quarter's warehouse district. They called themselves the Harrow Men, informally, though they had no official name, because people with official names can be legally addressed. They collected what they called protection fees from the smaller merchants and residents of the quarter, and they reported, though this was not widely spoken about, to a man named Croft, who was, officially, the assistant to the city's guard captain. Alistair had known about Croft for 6 months. He was one of the threads he was unraveling, carefully and completely, before making his move. Croft, and 3 others above him, connected to an embezzlement operation that had been bleeding the city's public funds for 11 years. What he had not anticipated was Croft becoming aware of the North Cottage's location. They came on a Tuesday evening, 4 of them, rough and confident with the confidence of men who had never had consequences. Elara was in the kitchen when she heard the sound at the gate. Jasper was at the table. He was up and at the door before she had processed what the sound was. She followed him to the doorway. The 4 men were inside the gate. Their leader, a broad man with a broken nose, and the casual posture of someone who considered himself the most dangerous person in any room he entered, was looking at Jasper with an expression of contemptuous amusement. "Croft's man. Beggar man. You're on ground that people are interested in. Time to find somewhere else to play house." Jasper, This property belongs to the Ashford estate. I have a legal residence here. Croftsman. Legal, that's a lovely word. A very useful word. Not much help tonight, though. The man took a step forward, and Alistair made a decision. He put the staff down. He did not lean on it. He did not drag his foot. He simply set it against the doorframe, straightened to his full height, and looked at the man with an expression that Elara, watching from 2 steps behind him, had never seen on his face before. It was authority, not anger, not bravado. The specific, unmistakable expression of a person who knows they are in command of a situation and has no need to prove it loudly. Jasper, I would think very carefully before taking another step. The man laughed, and then stopped laughing, because Jasper had moved. Elara would not have been able to describe precisely what happened in the next 30 seconds if her life had depended on it. It was controlled, it was precise, and it was entirely without the frailty of any man who had been broken. 2 of them went down. The other 2 retreated to the gate with a speed that was, in its own way, an acknowledgement. The leader picked himself up from the ground and looked at Jasper with an expression that had entirely shed its contempt. Croftsman, who are you? Jasper said nothing. He picked up his staff. He stepped back into the doorframe. Jasper, I suggest you go. They went. Inside the cottage, the silence was very large. Elara was standing in the kitchen doorway. Jasper came inside, put the staff back against the wall, and went to the table. He sat down. He looked at the lamp. She came and sat across from him. They were quiet for a long moment. Elara, you need to tell me something true. He looked up from the lamp. Jasper, yes. Elara, not all of it. I understand there are things you cannot or will not tell me yet. But something is true. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Jasper, I am not who I appear to be. I am doing something in this city that I believe matters, and it is not finished yet. The cottage, this location, is part of it. When it is finished, everything will be different, for both of us. She looked at him. Elara, is what you are doing good? Are you trying to hurt people, or help them? Jasper, help. Specifically the people who have been hurt by the people who are currently very comfortable. She held his gaze for a long time. Long enough that another man might have looked away. He did not. Elara, all right. Jasper, all right. Elara, I believe you. For now, that is enough. He let out a slow breath that he had been holding without knowing it. And then she did something unexpected. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Briefly, the way you might reach for a person who is standing at the edge of something high, and you want them to know you are aware they are there. She withdrew it, almost immediately, and went to put more water on the fire. He sat at the table and looked at the place where her hand had been. This is becoming complicated. I told myself it would not. I was wrong. Genevieve found out on a Wednesday. She was not supposed to find out at all. It was the kind of information that Eleanora hoarded carefully, passing it out to her daughter in doses calibrated to produce the desired effect. But Genevieve had been reading her mother's correspondence for 3 years, quietly and without detection, because Genevieve was not quite as purely vain as people assumed. She was also calculating. The letter she read was from one of the court officials Eleanora had bribed. It said, among other things, that the Duke's recent movements had been traced to the official records office, the city's legal archives, and on 2 separate occasions, the vicinity of the North Estate cottage. The North Estate cottage, where Elara and the beggar lived. Genevieve sat with this information for a long time. She was not stupid. She could see the shape of it. A man investigating the city's power structures, spending time near a property that had, historically, been adjacent to significant financial dealings. A beggar who lived there with legal residence. She thought it could be a coincidence. She thought it is not a coincidence. She thought, if I tell Mother, she will panic and do something irreversible, and I will lose control of the outcome. She thought, if the beggar is the Duke, and the Duke is now married to Elara, then I am already too late, and the only thing left is damage control. I will say nothing. I will let Mother's plan play out. And when it collapses, because it will collapse, I will position myself as the wronged innocent. The daughter who was deceived, not the daughter who deceived. It was, as plans went, the coward's option. But Genevieve had learned from her mother that the coward's option, executed with sufficient style, could look very much like wisdom. Eleanora, meanwhile, had received news that galvanized her entirely. The Duke had officially communicated through the city register that he would be attending a grand presentation ball to be held in 6 weeks. He would, at that ball, be formally presenting himself to the city's society and, the announcement implied, considering the question of a suitable match with appropriate seriousness. Eleanora read the notice and felt something unlock in her that had been under considerable strain for months. 6 weeks. It was enough time. Barely, but enough. She immediately began arrangements to host the ball herself, which required a series of carefully worded negotiations with the city register, an expenditure that made her accountant go slightly pale, and the calling in of every social favor she had accumulated over 15 years. She succeeded. The grand presentation ball would be held in her rented ballroom, the same one she had used for the luncheon, the grandest available in the city, and Lady Eleanora Ashford would be its official hostess.
Lady Eleanora, this is it, Genevieve. This is what everything has been building toward.
You will be presented at this ball. The Duke will be there. You will be the most impressive woman in the room, Genevieve. And if he does not take an interest, Lady Eleanora, he will. I have made certain of it. Genevieve looked at her mother for a moment. Genevieve, you have made certain of it. Lady Eleanora, I have had a word with the right people. The Duke's formal introduction will be arranged to place him in proximity to you specifically. Trust me. Genevieve said nothing. She smiled at her mother's smile. I am watching a woman set a trap that has already been sprung. She simply does not know it yet. An invitation arrived at the North Cottage 3 days later. Formal, sealed in dark red wax. Elara turned it over in her hands before opening it. The seal was unfamiliar, not any family crest she recognized, not the city register's mark. Something older, something that felt, in an indefinable way, significant. She opened it. Read it again. She put it on the table and went to find Jasper. He was in the small yard at the back of the cottage, doing something with the wood stack that did not, on reflection, require the concentration he was giving it. He looked up when she appeared, and she held out the invitation without speaking. He read it. His expression did not change, but something in his posture, the set of his shoulders, some barely perceptible shift, told her that this was not news to him. Elara, you sent this. It was not a question. He set the card down. Jasper, I think it is time I told you something more than the minimum. Elara, I think so too. They went inside. They sat at the table, and he told her. Not everything. There were details that had to wait, that were bound up with the investigation in ways that required care. But enough. His name, his title. The 8 months of work that had brought him to the canal bridge, and then, unexpectedly, to this cottage and to the woman sitting across from him, who was listening to him with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, complete, unhurried, and entirely undeceived. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Elara, the north room under the cottage, the one I found with the false floorboard. Jasper, you found that. Elara, 3 weeks ago, I did not touch anything. I covered it back over. He looked at her with an expression that was, beneath the surface, a kind of wonder. Jasper, you found that, and you said nothing. Elara, I was waiting for you to trust me enough to tell me yourself. He was quiet. Elara, is there enough? In what you have gathered, is there enough to move against them? Jasper, almost. The ball gives me the last piece. I need to confront them publicly, with the evidence I have, in the presence of enough witnesses that the story cannot be suppressed afterward. Elara, my stepmother's ballroom. Jasper, yes. She looked at the invitation on the table between them. Elara. Then we go to the ball. They had 2 weeks. The first thing Alistair did was send word to his team, the 3 people who had been operating at careful distances for the better part of a year. They came to the cottage in the early morning of the second day. A quiet woman named Mara, who was his legal secretary. A compact, watchful man named Dex, who handled logistics, and an older man called Pemberton, who was, officially, the Duke of Aldenmere's estate steward, and who had been waiting with considerable patience for his employer to stop being a drifter and start being a duke. Elara met them at the door and offered them tea, which flustered Pemberton slightly. He had been told about the marriage, but had not fully processed the reality of it, and charmed Mara entirely. Mara, she is better than you deserve. Alistair, I know. I am going to say that again at a more dramatic moment, but I want you to note that I said it first here. The documents that came out of the hidden room beneath the cottage were 43 pages of falsified municipal accounts, 17 signed authorization letters, and a ledger that connected Croft, the guard captain, and 2 city councillors to 11 years of systematic theft from public infrastructure funds. Mara went through 9kk. I'm a 666 them at the kitchen table over 2 days, cross-referencing against the copies of official records that Alistair had been gathering from the city's archives. When she was done, she sat back and was quiet for a long moment. Mara, this will destroy them. Alistair, that is the intention. Mara, and Lady Eleanora? Alistair, she is in the ledger. Pages 31 through 34. Mara turned to the pages. Read them. Looked up. Mara. She was not just bribing officials. She was a known recipient of diverted funds. Alistair. For 6 years. She knew where the money was coming from. She used it to sustain the estate. After her husband's business interests failed, 2 years before he died, there was silence. Elara. She was using stolen public money. While she told my father the estate was prospering, she said it calmly. Her voice was very steady. Elara. And my father never knew. Alistair. The accounts were managed through her own solicitor. He is also in the ledger. Elara looked at the window for a moment. Then she straightened, and something resold in her face that had the quality of a door, closing quietly, but completely. Elara. All right. What do we do next? 5 days before the ball, Mara produced a gown. She arrived with it in a large paper-wrapped parcel and placed it on the bed in Elara's room without ceremony. Then stepped back and looked at Elara with the expression of someone who had done their research. Mara, he described you. I had it made to the description. Elara, he described me. Mara, in considerable detail, yes. The exact shade of blue, the way he wanted the lace. He was very specific. Elara looked at the parcel. Elara, that seems unlike him. Mara, yes. That is why I am mentioning it. She opened the parcel. The gown was deep sapphire, not navy, not sky, but the precise blue of deep water lit from below. The bodice was fitted with silver threadwork at the seams. The skirts moved with the particular weight of very good silk. It was the most beautiful garment Elara had ever been in the same room with, and she stood there looking at it for a long moment, before she trusted herself to speak. Elara, it is the color of the dress I wore to the ceremony. Mara, yes. Elara, he noticed that. Mara, he notices everything. It is both his greatest strength and his most exhausting quality. Alistair knocked on her door the evening before the ball. He was dressed, for the first time in 8 months, as himself. A dark formal coat, perfectly fitted, the ducal signet ring on his right hand, his hair clean and properly arranged. He looked, she thought, like the portrait of someone important that she had not been aware she had in her mind until she saw the original. She was in the gown. Mara had pinned her hair up in the elaborate style of someone who understood both fashion and the specific architecture of Elara's features. They looked at each other in the doorway for a moment. Alistair, I owe you an explanation, a proper one, not just the operational summary I gave you. Elara, You do not owe me, Alistair. I do. I agreed to this arrangement for reasons that were about my work. I used the cottage and the marriage as cover. You did not deserve that, and I am aware of it, and I am sorry." She was quiet for a moment. "Elara, you were also, in a roundabout way, investigating the people who had spent years making my life very small. And you fixed the fireplace. And you found out about my father's estate books and did not tell me what to look for in them, because you thought I should find it myself. Alistair, that last part. Elara, am I wrong?" A pause. "No." She stepped into the doorway and looked up at him. "Elara, we will settle the rest of the accounting after tomorrow. For now, are we ready?" Alistair, "I believe so." Elara, "Then let us go and be who we actually are." The ballroom was magnificent. Eleanora had outdone herself. The chandeliers blazed with 200 candles each. The floral arrangements were white roses and deep green foliage, banked along the walls in arrangements that required 3 people each to carry. The floor had been freshly waxed. The orchestra was the best in the city. The guest list was everyone who mattered in 3 counties. Eleanora stood at the top of the grand staircase, with Genevieve beside her, both in their finest, and she genuinely felt that she was at the summit of something she had been climbing for 20 years. Genevieve was in ivory silk, with diamonds at her throat. She was beautiful. She had her mother's carriage and her own youth, and she looked, standing there in that light, exactly like what she was supposed to be. The most eligible young woman in the room. The room was full. The orchestra was playing something light and practiced. Couples moved on the floor. Eleanora swept her gaze around the room with the particular pleasure of a woman in command of her setting. Then the footman at the bottom of the main entrance struck his staff on the marble floor. The sound carried. The orchestra slowed, then stopped. The room turned. Footman, His Grace, the Duke of Aldenmere, and Her Grace, the Duchess of Aldenmere. The doors opened. They descended the entrance steps into the ballroom, and the room, which had been full of movement and conversation and music, went completely still. Alistair Rowan, Duke of Aldenmere, was not what the room had been expecting. He moved with the kind of certainty that money can polish but cannot create it in the bone, in the way he held himself, in the way his eyes moved across the room with the same watchfulness she had seen in the cottage doorway, but visible now for what it was. Not the wariness of a man at the bottom, the attention of a man who sees everything and is deciding what to do about it, but the woman beside him. The woman beside him was what silenced the room. She wore sapphire silk, and she walked with the precise, unhurried composure of someone who has been through the worst thing that can be done to a person's dignity, and has come through the other side of it, knowing exactly who she is. Her dark hair was pinned with small silver pins. Her chin was level. Her eyes moved around the room without hurry. She was looking for her stepmother. She found her. Lady Eleanora was standing at the top of the staircase, with her china-white face and her perfect posture, and a smile that had, in the last 5 seconds, stopped working correctly. It was still there. The arrangement of muscles was still there, but the thing behind it, the confidence that had animated it for 20 years, was gone, because she was looking at her stepdaughter. Her stepdaughter, in a sapphire gown, with a duke at her side, descending into her ballroom, and the shape of everything she had built for the last year was rearranging itself in front of her eyes into its true configuration. Genevieve had gone very still. The room had not stopped looking. Alistair guided Elara to the center of the floor, where a space had naturally formed around them. He did not rush. He stopped, turned to face the room, and waited for the silence to become the kind of silence that is actually listening. Alistair, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the warmth of your welcome to this city. I am pleased to be here, and I am pleased to introduce my wife, Elara, Duchess of Aldenmere, whom some of you may already know by her former name, Miss Elara Ashford. The sound that went through the room was not quite a gasp, and not quite a murmur. It was both at once. Elara inclined her head, graceful, unhurried. The gesture of a woman who is precisely where she expected to be. At the top of the staircase, Eleanora did not incline her head at all. She stood like a woman who had put her foot on what she believed to be solid ground and found nothing beneath it. Alistair did not allow the moment to simply be a social revelation. He had given enough time, perhaps 90 seconds, for the room to absorb what they had seen. Then he spoke again. His voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The room was so quiet that the candles seemed loud. Alistair, I came to this city 8 months ago, not as a duke making social calls, but as a man with a specific purpose. This city's public infrastructure funds that pay for roads, for water systems, and for the basic functions of a well-ordered community have been systematically stolen for 11 years. The evidence is documented, verified, and has been provided this afternoon to the city's chief magistrate and 2 independent legal officers. Arrests are being made, as we speak, in 3 locations. The room had gone from a social silence to a different kind of silence, the kind where no one breathes. Alistair, the individuals whose names appear in those documents include people in this room tonight. He did not look at Eleanora. He did not need to. Half the room looked for him, and then the doors of the ballroom opened again, not the grand entrance doors, the side service doors, and 4 city constables walked in. They crossed the floor with the unhurried certainty of people who know exactly where they are going. They stopped at the base of the staircase. Eleanora descended 1 step, then stopped. Constable, Lady Eleanora Ashford, we have a warrant for your attendance before the Chief Magistrate regarding charges of receiving and concealing fraudulently obtained public funds. The room was so quiet that you could hear the candles. Eleanora looked at the constable. She looked at her daughter, who had taken 1 very deliberate step backward. She looked, finally, across the room at Elara, and Elara looked back at her. No triumph in it, no cruelty, just clear. The truth is clear when it finally surfaces after a long time underwater. Lady Eleanora descended the remaining stairs with her chin level and her spine straight, because whatever else she was not going to give the room the satisfaction of watching her crumble in public. Elara, watching her go, felt something she had not expected. Not satisfaction, and certainly not joy. Something quieter than both. The particular stillness of a long tension that has finally been allowed to resolve. Genevieve left the ball without speaking to anyone. She was not arrested. She had, in her calculating silence, ensured that she had touched nothing legally, participated in nothing formally. She would face social consequences, but not legal ones. Elara, asked about Genevieve some weeks later by a legal officer compiling the full record, gave answers that were precise and complete. She did not embellish. She did not minimize it. She said what she knew, and she said it clearly. Elara, Genevieve knew more than she admitted. Whether that rises to a legal question is not mine to determine. But she was not innocent, and I will not say she was. The legal officer noted this down and moved on. 3 months after the ball, a different legal officer arrived at the Aldenmere townhouse, which was, by then, Elara's primary residence, with a file of papers relating to her father's estate. The solicitor, Mr. Hemford, had come with him. He looked significantly older than he had at the estate reading, and also, somehow, relieved. Mr. Hemford, there was an addendum to Lord Ashford's will, a sealed codicil that Lady Eleanora had, that was withheld from the initial reading, by instruction of the same solicitor, who has since been removed from practice. The codicil contains a specific provision. He set the document in front of Elara. She read it slowly. Read it again. Put it down. Elara. He wrote this himself. Mr. Hemford. In his own hand, witnessed by 2 independent parties. Yes. Your father was a man who worried about you, Miss Your Grace. He knew that wealth could be taken. He wanted to ensure that if a man chose you for yourself, rather than for what you appeared to have, the full inheritance would follow. He trusted that that man once found, would be someone worth trusting. Elara was quiet for a moment, he knew. He could not protect me from Eleanora's long game, but he could leave me this. He left me this. She looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked up at Hemford. Elara, thank you, Mr. Hemford, for bringing this, and for being here. Mr. Hemford, it was the least I could do. Far less than I should have done, years ago. I am sorry for that. Elara, I know, and I accept it. That evening, Elara sat with Alistair in the library of the townhouse, a proper library, floor to ceiling, the kind she had spent 22 years quietly dreaming about, and she told him about the codicil. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Alistair, your father was a more careful man than he appeared. Elara, he trusted people too much, but he tried to build a safeguard into the things he could not control. That is also a kind of wisdom, I think. Alistair, you do not sound angry. Elara, I was, for about 3 minutes, and then I remembered that he sat with me every evening for the first 9 years of my life, and taught me to read and to think, and to watch the world carefully. He gave me the tools. Eleanora could take the estate. She could not take the tools. Alistair looked at her. Alistair, what do you want to do with it? The inheritance. She thought about it. Not in the way of a woman who is uncertain, but in the way of a woman who already knows the answer, and is deciding how to say it. Elara, the canal quarter, the east, the children who carried loads too heavy for them, the people who paid protection money to Croft, because they had no other choice. They paid for infrastructure that was stolen from them. I want to use my father's money to begin paying it back. He looked at her for a long moment. Alistair, that will take years. Elara, most things worth doing take years. He almost smiled. The careful, contained expression she had first seen in the solicitor's outer office. The one that was not quite a smile, but was something more deliberate than one. Alistair, I should tell you something. Elara, you have been telling me things for 3 months. I am beginning to enjoy it. He looked at her directly, the way he always looked at her, steady, without pretense, with that quality of attention that she had recognized from the very first day as the most honest thing about him. Alistair, I chose to stay. At the ceremony, I could have arranged a different cover, but I chose the cottage and the marriage and this specific arrangement because I had met you in that office and I thought you were worth knowing. And I was right, and I wanted you to know that I was aware, the entire time, that you were the most important variable in this whole operation. Not the documents, not the ledger, you. The library was very quiet. Outside, the city was going about its evening carriages and lamplighters, and the sound of someone, somewhere, playing a fiddle in the street below. Elara looked at her husband, the man who had arrived in her life as a stranger, with calloused hands and watchful eyes, and had, over the course of 8 months, become the most honest person she knew. Elara, you are very bad at saying the simple version of things. Alistair, yes. Elara, the simple version, for future reference is, I chose you. That would have sufficed. Alistair, I chose you. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she set down the document she had been holding, crossed the library, and sat beside him. His arm came around her with the ease of something that has been practiced, which it had in 100 small gestures over 100 small evenings in a cottage on the edge of a bog, where 2 people had begun telling each other the truth before either of them had decided to. She put her head against his shoulder. The library was warm. The city was alive outside. The accounts were finally, properly settled. This story is about many things, but at its heart, it is about this. Power that is built on cruelty is always temporary, because cruelty requires constant maintenance, new targets, new humiliations, new arrangements to keep the structure standing. But dignity, once found inside a person, requires no maintenance at all. It simply is. And it waits, with the patience of something that knows its own worth, for the moment when the structures built against it finally exhaust themselves. Elara's greatest strength was never her inheritance, her father's hidden codicil, or the Duke who arrived in her life through a twisted set of circumstances. Her greatest strength was the fact that she refused to let cruelty teach her to be cruel. That, after years of being made smaller, she still looked at a stranger across a dusty office floor and offered him the minimum. I will not be unkind to you. The moral of kindness is not that it always wins immediately. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes it waits in a cold cottage on a bog and makes soup from 3 potatoes and a string of herbs and keeps its accounts by lamplight. But it is always there. It does not expire. And when the moment comes, and the moment always comes, it is the kindness that the room remembers. Subscribe to see how this story unfolds, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. I would genuinely love to say hello to you and know how far our story has traveled.